History as it happens, November 18th, 2025. Conservatism at a crossroads.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
We, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom.
Like many of you, last month I watched that giant masquerade ball up at Madison Square Garden, where 20,000 liberals and radicals came dressed up as moderates and centrists in the greatest single exhibition of cross-dressing in American political history.
Our radical Democrat opponents are driven by hatred, prejudice, and rage. They want to destroy you, and they want to destroy our country as we know it.
Divisions within the conservative movement, or more broadly on the American right, divisions that had been simmering, boiled over after Tucker Carlson gave a chummy interview to a Holocaust-denying white supremacist. But why now? After all, cruelty, ignorance, racism, anti-government fanaticism, what some call right-wing populism, have been hallmarks of the age of Trump. Is Trumpism a disaster for, or departure from, the conservative movement that elected Ronald Reagan some 45 years ago? That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So to jump to the end of the story in Trump, I would say, of course he's a conservative. He's a populist conservative.
Donald Trump is a really unique figure, unique talent, unique personality, unique baggage. But Trump's ability to survive the things that he has survived politically, to conjure the support that he has, I think that's unique, and I think it's going to be really hard for anybody else to replicate it.
Do you remember Glenn Beck's Fox News show about 15 years ago? Day after day after day, Beck warned Americans that President Barack Obama wasn't merely a bad president, but was trying to destroy the United States.
Now, I'd love to see the president come out and denounce socialism, Marxist, communist, revolutionaries. Once, Mr. President, once deny Marxism, communism, revolutionaries. Tell us you are against all of this.
Now, these preposterously ignorant and unhinged rants were popular with the Tea Party. That was the populist backlash against the government bailouts that followed the '08 crash and Obama's signature health care bill. In 2010, the month before Republicans would pick up 63 House seats in the midterm elections, the historian Sean Wilentz penned an essay in The New Yorker about the Glenn Beck Tea Party phenomenon. As Wilentz put it, the resurgence of extremism on the Republican right. When William F. Buckley died in 2008, it seemed to symbolize the end of a conservative era, Wilentz said. David Klinghoffer, a former literary editor at National Review, lamented that urbane visionaries and builders of institutions such as William F. Buckley have been replaced by media figures who make their money by stirring fears and resentments. Conservatism, Klinghoffer added, has undergone a shift toward demagoguery and hucksterism, and is now ruled by those he called the crazy cons. Wilentz went on to say, it appears that the extreme right wing is on the verge of securing a degree of power over Congress and the Republican Party that is unprecedented in modern American history. For defenders of national cohesion and tempered adversity in our politics, it is an alarming state of affairs, said Sean Wilentz about 15 years ago.
All of these groups and the President of the United States want nothing short of fundamental transformation of America. It is not about cleaning up corruption. It is only a beginning of a radical, revolutionary, Marxist land.
Now, fast forward to 2025, and the far right may be more bonkers today, more populist, although it is a phony populism, as racists, nativists, and conspiracy theorists dominate the social media algorithm. So you're probably aware by now of the nuclear blast on the American right, provoked by Tucker Carlson's interview with Nicholas Fuentes. He's an internet troll with an apparently large following of young men known as groypers. But Fuentes has been around for a few years now. He ate dinner with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago once. And here he is on some podcast in 2023, unable to say if Adolf Hitler was a bad guy.
Simple yes or no answer. Hitler, good guy, bad guy?
That's a tough. Well, there are no good and bad guys. They're just people.
Well, that's not true, dude.
It is true.
I mean, so if you had to check one box.
I'm going to say I'm neutral on that. I'm abstaining from that.
There's no neutral.
You're saying that Hitler was not a bad guy?
I think that, it's a
But then
world
you're
war.
questioning why people may not want you talking?
There's
I'm
a
giving
lot,
you a
well,
platform.
Look, if we're going to say Hitler bad, then I'm going to say Churchill bad, and I'm going to say Roosevelt bad, and I'm going to say they're all bad. But if we look at him as a product of his time in that moment, we have to judge him with those things in mind. That's all.
Now, I'm not going to get into all the details here, how this is convulsing the Heritage Foundation among other conservative institutions. You can read about it all in the newspapers. 1,000 op-eds have been written, some by more traditional or Reaganite conservative intellectuals lamenting what's happening to their movement in the age of Trump. Is MAGA a departure from Reaganism or a continuity? Well, that may depend on how you choose to remember Reagan and compare his personality and style or the legacy of his conservative administration to what is happening today. In his book, The Age of Reagan, the aforementioned Sean Wilentz wrote, one effect of the changes brought on by Reaganism was to make the Republican Party far more conservative than it had ever been. Despite his rhetoric, Reagan neither identified closely with the religious right nor expended much immediate political capital on its behalf. Yet by formally endorsing the evangelical conservative cause and cultivating its political support, Reagan brought into the Republican Party, especially at the state and local level, large cadres of indefatigable culture warriors who would battle hard for the party's soul and the nation's. Likewise, whatever his personal views were about racial justice, Reagan's rhetoric, as well as the policies of his Department of Justice, greatly reassured the enemies of the civil rights reform, their politics forged in the reaction to the advances of the 1960s, that he was on their side. The Republican Party was no longer the party of Lincoln, says Wilentz. Although Reagan himself, as a Union president and governor, was practiced in political compromise, not all conservative Republicans in or outside Washington shared his temperament. Some truly saw themselves as political revolutionaries. In 1987, Pat Buchanan, while still serving as the White House communications director, declared that the greatest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. Again, that is Sean Wilentz in his book, The Age of Reagan. So some continuities may be apparent there. Some ideas, such as those embraced by Pat Buchanan, would need time with the onset of post-Cold War globalization to win something close to majority support among Republican voters, such as hostility to immigration and free trade.
Mr. Buchanan, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
All right, sure, NAFTA was really a wonderful deal for America. 2 years after we negotiated and signed it, our trade surplus is gone. We got a $15 billion trade deficit with Mexico. 300,000 jobs have gone south. The Florida winter tomato industry's on its back. Illegal immigration is soaring into this country. Mexico's the prime source of narcotics and drugs. And my good friend Senator Dole negotiated a $50 billion bailout with Bill Clinton for the regime that brought this all about. Why? Because Mexico needed the money to pay back Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Goldman Sachs. Now, I plead guilty, Bob, to wanting to protect American workers making $10 an hour in South Carolina textile mills from having to compete with Mexicans making $1 an hour. That's just not fair. That is un-American. But Bob, when Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Goldman Sachs got into trouble, you turned into a protectionist with Bill Clinton and Mr. Rubin, Mr. Greenspan, and all of you got together and bailed out that government. Why didn't you let those fellas test the magic of the marketplace like you want American workers to do?
In my view, today's anti-government fanaticism on the right is an outgrowth of the Reagan years, although more radical. Reagan himself subscribed to some zany ideas in his early political career, as when he campaigned against an early version of Medicare in 1961, because, in his view, it would lead to socialism in America.
One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. It's very easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. Most people are a little reluctant to oppose anything that suggests medical care for people who possibly can't afford it. Write those letters now, call your friends and tell them to write them. If you don't, this program, I promise you, will pass just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow. And behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. Until, one day, as Norman Thomas said, we will awake to find that we have socialism. And if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
At the same time, it would be wrong to draw a straight line from William F. Buckley to Ronald Reagan to Pat Buchanan to Donald Trump. It would be unfair, too, to Buckley and Reagan. So how do we untangle these historical threads that may or may not connect the past with this current insane moment? Writing in the New York Times, the political theorist Damon Linker says, could Mr. Trump prove to be a temporary aberration? Might the Republican Party return to its Reaganite essence once the man who has done so much to trash it finally leaves the Oval Office in a few years? In other words, says Linker, is the future of the Republican Party Reaganism or Trumpism? The answer, he says, is most likely Trumpism. Viewed in the long arc of American political history, it is the Reaganite dispensation that appears to be an aberration. Damon Linker is a senior lecturer in the political science department at the University of Pennsylvania. He writes the Notes from the Middle Ground newsletter on Substack. Damon and I are joined by Dan McLaughlin, a senior writer for the National Review, which was founded by William F. Buckley in 1955. McLaughlin has written that it was the election of 2012, Obama over Romney, not 2016, that sent us reeling. Our conversation next, but remember, you can enjoy ad-free listening, plus bonus content, and access to the entire catalog of 500 episodes by tapping subscribe now in the show notes. Or go to historyasithappens.supercast.com. It is easy. It is only $5 a month, and it'll help keep this podcast going. Damon Linker, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, as always, Martin.
Thank you for writing great pieces in the New York Times and at your Substack about this very issue. Gives me some ammunition for my questions. Dan McLaughlin, welcome back. It's been a bit.
Glad to be here.
First question for you, Dan. But first, I just want to say, I hope you don't feel left out. You're the only one in this conversation who did not graduate from Ithaca College. So,
the center of American civilization.
Yeah.
Where'd you go to law school?
Harvard.
Yeah, I went to Sing Sing. That's a joke my grandfather used to tell me when I asked him where he went to school. All right, first question for you. You're a senior writer at the conservative flagship. You've been paying attention to all of this. Matter of fact, one of your colleagues has been breaking news about this story. Is conservatism facing a crossroads or a crisis right now, and why is that important?
So I start with three priors about this. The first is the history of American politics and Republican politics and conservative movement politics in America is cyclical. It's never static. There are no permanent victories or permanent defeats. The Republican Party, from its beginning, even though it's been the more demographically homogenous and ideological of the two parties, had all these sort of different groups, ideological and sometimes overlapping ideological groups within it. You know, the classical liberals, the conservatives, traditional conservatives, the moderates, the populists, the progressives, the isolationists, etc. There's always been this struggle for control. You know, no faction has really maintained it for very long. I think the Reaganite dispensation was maybe the longest period of that, if you will. But, you know, I mean, you go from McKinley to Teddy Roosevelt back to Harding and Coolidge, and then from them back to Hoover and the moderates being back in control. So it has been in the past, so I think it will continue to be in the future. My second prior here is that leadership matters. It matters a lot. I think a lot of Americans, a lot of Republicans followed George W. Bush where he wanted to go. They followed Donald Trump where he wanted to go. A lot of them are the same people who were enthusiastic about Mitt Romney. Our leadership fights, they look like destiny only in retrospect. I think in 1980, you know, we were well set up for the conservative moment, but if somebody with Reagan's talent on the moderate side had been facing off against like Phil Crane, maybe the moderates win. You know, in 1952, if Ike doesn't declare as a Republican and Robert Taft, Mr. Conservative, is facing off against the logical heir apparent to Tom Dewey, which is Earl Warren, I think Taft probably wins. You know, leadership does matter a lot, and it really does shift the party in different directions. So you could tell the same story on the Democratic side, right, about like Obama and Hillary.
Well, timing is everything, but go ahead.
Well, no, the timing definitely helps one side or another, but the personalities also matter.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
the
it was
third
better
part-
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was better for Reagan not to win in 76. He was able to run in 80 with a, bad economy and an unpopular incumbent. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was. And my third point is that Donald Trump is a really unique figure, unique talent, unique personality, unique baggage. But Trump's ability to survive the things that he has survived politically, to conjure the support that he has and keep it immune to being penetrated by anything else from the outside, I think that's unique. And I think it's going to be really hard for anybody else to replicate it. I think we've seen a lot of other people on the populist right, like the statewide level, who tried to beat Trump and they're not. So I think when you add those three factors together, I think when you finally get to the period that is post-Trump, which might not be 2029, because if the next presidential election is either won by J.D. Vance or lost by the Republicans, one way or another, Trump is still sort of the de facto leader of the party at that point. But when you eventually do get to the post-Trump moment that is literally post-Trump himself, I think an awful lot is up for grabs. And I think one of the reasons why you have this kind of crisis atmosphere already is that people are looking to what comes after Trump, and they're starting to fight. It's like they're fighting over the will before the body's in the coffin.
So, Damon, before you jump in here, I just want to amend what I said. When I said Reagan, it was good for him that he didn't win in 76. I was referring to the GOP nomination, which then allowed him to run as the GOP nominee 4 years later, and he defeated Carter. But just to reset, Damon, is conservatism in a crisis or a crossroads right now? We're talking about Dan's conservative movement.
I do think so, but it's a crisis that began 10 years ago, if not earlier. I mean, I think that it makes sense to understand a kind of ongoing adjustment and wrestling with different threads within the conservative tradition that have definitely been on and off again ever since the end of the Cold War. You had a kind of moment where Pat Buchanan challenges George H.W. Bush for re-election in 1992. That it was a moment where there was a debate within the party, like, which direction are we going to go? Does the end of the Cold War signal a broader shift in what the party stands for?
What is the White House answer to the recession that was caused by its own breach of faith? It is to deny there is a recession. Well, let them come to New Hampshire.
Because that was such a strange election with Perot in it and getting 19% of the vote. And then we got 8 years of Clinton. That debate sort of got frozen. And then George W. Bush, when he ran, was definitely able to kind of reunify the party. And recall that when he ran in 2000, he ran as someone who was skeptical of nation building and wanted a very light sort of come home America message was part of his campaign. And I don't think it was like a McGovernite shift or toward isolationism, but it definitely was one that seemed to be very post-Cold War. And I think that was a very effective way for him to meet that feeling. There was a rising kind of skepticism about American intervention in a lot of theaters of the world through the 90s in response to some of Clinton's kind of soft interventionism in the Balkans and the Horn of Africa and so forth. And so if there hadn't been a 9/11, I do think that we might have seen a much more gradual evolution of the Republican Party back toward something between what we now call the old and the new right. But instead, we got 9/11, which led George W. Bush, putting aside the question of whether this was prudentially wise, to jumpstart a Cold War Part 2, but now against Islamic terrorism. and to kind of internationalize American foreign policy in a way that far surpassed what we got under Reagan. Grand ambitions to democratize the Middle East to the point of a gun. And then this, of course, didn't work out great, which then required de facto occupation of at least two countries, plus drone warfare throughout a lot of the Muslim world that continued into the Obama administration. And then, of course, the financial crisis that also happened on Bush's watch at the very end. So all of those things together, combined with Obama winning, led, I think, the old pressure dating back to 92 to kind of build up in the Obama administration. You saw it in the Tea Party movement. I'm not one of those who thinks it was all astroturfed. This was a genuine, populist revolt against a lot of the Bush position on spending. And then, of course, what Obama was doing with bailing out Detroit and the banks, and then, of course, Affordable Care Act passage. And you saw the implications of that in a lot of the kind of chaotic primary in 2012, where, yes, Romney ended up getting the nomination, but it was a fight. There were kind of a series of trial balloons of kind of populist outsiders trying to get the nomination, and each of whom for a week or two would get the enthusiasm of a lot of the voters.
Michelle Bachmann.
Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, then the more serious ones like Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, one after another. If you look at the Real Clear Politics aggregate polling through that period, it's like a series of surges and then collapses, surges and then collapses, and then a kind of reluctant acceptance of the more Reaganite alternative in Romney and Ryan. And then they lost, and that led to more anger. And Trump came on the scene and kind of revived the hard Buchananite position on a lot of things in a very charismatic way that blew the whole thing wide open. From this kind of potted history I've just told, I think you can see that it didn't have to be this way. But because of the way these contingencies worked out with 9/11, how Bush handled it, and then the populist upsurge that really begins with Sarah Palin's vice presidential position and the McCain campaign and the Tea Party growing out of that. And then the fact that Trump was, a charismatic guy, funny. He didn't care about attacking his own party over Iraq, attacking George W. Bush from the debate stage. It all blows up, and we've been in the ensuing crisis for the last decade ever since. That's kind of how I'd answer your question.
Now, seriously, friends, neither Beltway party is going to drain this swamp, because to them it isn't a swamp. It's a protected wetland.
It's a campaign about rejecting the cynicism and elitism of our failed political establishment.
It was not some liberal Democrat who declared, "Read my lips, no new taxes."
I wrote a magazine piece on how 2012 is actually the election that drove America nuts. And it's a great example of my point, though, about how personalities and leaders matter, right? Because there was all of this enormous energy in the Tea Party to fuse the actually Reaganite economic views, small government, libertarianism, and all of that, and real social conservatism with this populist energy. When Romney defeated all of that in the primaries, kept the moderates in control, that pent-up demand then moved on to something that looked a lot less like a movement conservative fusion in 2016. And a lot of what went wrong was that at the moment that the Tea Party was at its peak, we didn't get a Tea Party nominee. We got the opposite.
Well, Dan, you've said Trump is not a conservative. I agree. He isn't a conservative, although there's still elements of what you might call traditional Reaganism there, the tax cuts, deregulation, etc. But he's not a conservative. And there's a Republican president now who isn't a conservative. I mean, what's the importance of that? I want to hear from both of you on that.
First of all, a Republican president who's not a conservative is also, that's how you would describe
most,
both Bushes and Ford and Nixon and Eisenhower and Hoover.
Wait, both Bushes. George W. Bush was not a conservative in your view?
No, I think he certainly was a guy who, in the 2000 primary, he was slightly the more conservative of the two candidates to McCain, although each of them was more conservative than the other on some issues. But he was definitely a guy who overall came from, I mean, there was a reason he tried to rebrand conservative as compassionate conservative as a kind of big government thing. So Bush was able to manage that straddle. He was certainly more conservative than his father.
Yes.
But he was definitely not somebody who movement conservatives saw as one of their own.
But just on the issue of immigration, and I'm going to get to a larger point in a moment after Damon's response, but Ronald Reagan was not hostile to immigration. He signed an amnesty. George W. Bush, who I thought was conservative, also wasn't hostile to immigration. So, I mean, that's just one example where I think the continuities are more important than some of the perceived differences, this departure from Reagan conservatism. Maybe we'll return to that in a bit.
My view is these debates, which I was on a Bulwark podcast for years, and we would talk about these kind of things every week. And some of those people were Reaganite conservatives, and then some moderate liberals like myself. And the end result of all of those discussions, plus my own reading in the history, I just think it's kind of silly to have debates about like this Republican president wasn't a conservative, this one was. I understand if you're in this movement and you're fighting kind of over territory and definition, that makes a kind of sense. But I just, what is conservatism? I don't know. Whatever people on the right side of the American spectrum call it at a given moment. I mean, you had, as Dan has mentioned, you had Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and those people were conservatives in the 20s, and they were basically laissez-faire people who didn't think the federal government should be doing much of anything to manage the economy, who kind of didn't like taxes and so forth. It was sort of like proto-economic libertarian types. And then you get what we call now the old right arises in reaction to the New Deal. And these were people who were kind of defending that older 1920s style conservatism, but in light of the fact that this new thing had happened, a kind of hyper-charged version of progressivism in the 30s, that those people thought was un-American, totally illegitimate, unacceptable, and should be rolled back entirely. And that position ends up being defended by Robert Taft in 1952, and there's a big fight in the party over that. And in the end, they go with Eisenhower, the war hero, because they probably largely because they figured that guy will win because he's like a hero to the country. Well, the end result of that is that Eisenhower just consolidates the New Deal, continues the Truman Cold War, accepts NATO, everything the Democrats did for 2 decades, just given a stamp of legitimacy by the Republican Party. And that understandably led a lot of conservatives who didn't like a lot of that stuff a target. The more extreme people in the movement wanted a total rollback, literally rollback of the Soviet Union in foreign policy, and then rollback of the New Deal. And the new right that Reagan is part of in 1964, when he gives his famous speech about Goldwater and his opposition to Medicare, in his famous statements in the mid-60s, that's a kind of the more severe end of that spectrum. But when he runs for president, he's sort of moderated a bit. He's like, oh, I loved FDR. I was a union guy. And then he becomes president and he does do big marginal tax rate cuts for income tax. He continues some of the deregulatory stuff that started under Carter. But other than that, federal spending continues on its trajectory. Very little has changed. There's no rollback in the New Deal. And I could go on, but my point is that like all of this is conservatism. It's like an ongoing fight about what are the principles of conservatives and then what are they willing pragmatically to live with in the realities of electoral politics at any given time as the decades go by. So to jump to the end of the story in Trump, I would say, of course he's a conservative. He's a populist conservative who has, flipped to anti-immigration. But there were conservatives in the past who were anti-immigration too. I mean,
that's a bipartisan thing too. I mean, this started, the enforcement starts under Clinton, really.
All Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
Of course it did. I mean, the Democrats historically, at least for the last several decades before Trump, were the more draconian on immigration and deportations for like labor union reasons. Bernie Sanders is kind of an immigration hawk relative to a lot of the Republican positions under Reagan and the two Bushes. I just see it as much more of a kind of ongoing fight about this stuff. Now, the thing that's least conservative about Trump is that his kind of style, his personal morality. There's something about Reagan when you go back, when I teach my conservatism course, I often show the first inaugural of Reagan, and the students today can't believe what they're hearing because he just sounds so earnest and moral and
sunny
almost
optimism.
Sunny, but I don't just mean the optimism. I mean a kind of morally upstanding. He just seems like a decent man who believes in good things and virtue, and that, he has a sunny outlook that if the government just gets out of the way, this kind of sunny and virtuous American default position will just sort of emerge and triumph in the country. So in that respect, Trump is not conservative. He's a kind of sleazebag, tabloid press, New York City, outer borough, crap talking, rabble rouser. But that doesn't have a lot of policy substance to it. And so on the policy issues, that's where I'm much more inclined to just be we can't really define what's a conservative or not.
I think if you want to talk about conservatism in crisis, immigration and trade, for example, are issues that have divided the Republican Party since day one, literally day one in 1854. I think foreign policy, there's been that as well. Long-standing disagreements within the party, different factions in charge at different times. But I think the two aspects of Trump and Trumpism, to the extent there's an ism beyond just the man, and I think Damon hits on one of them, which is this idea that, even if your political leaders aren't always the most saintly figures, and politicians tend not to be, that the ideal of standing up for a moral and virtuous country, and the idea that politicians are supposed to at least aspire to that publicly is something that's been sort of lost under Trump. Maybe not permanently, because I think it still matters. It's still an asset in politics to be like that. But there are certainly people who argue that it's the time for that is over and all of that. You have to know what time it is and all that sort of thing. But I think the bigger one that we're facing right now that is, is a serious crisis is that the Republican Party was founded as fundamentally a classically liberal party. Lincoln was probably the most purely classical liberal figure in the history of the American presidency.
Free soil, free people, yeah.
Yeah, free men, free soil, free labor, free speech. Those principles that go back to the Declaration and the Constitution, the American founding, they're part of our American patrimony. I think a big part of the whole National Review, Buckley, and then Reagan project was to fuse that with traditional conservatism and explain why the two fit together naturally, in part because conservatives believe in conserving our national heritage, and this happens to be our national heritage, our patrimony. There is a move underway, particularly among the younger generation, to kind of discard all of that, the rule of written law and equal justice and, rejection of identity politics. And frankly, I think liberalism in its classical form has been dead in the Democratic Party for a very long time. It is alarming to see it under siege in the Republican Party, which is its only potential remaining home. And that, I think, is if you're looking for where people in my position as sort of movement conservatives are looking ahead to, do we have a real crisis on our hands? That, as much as anything, is that crisis.
Yeah. Damon gave us a nice, as he said, potted history of this. But I want to focus in on a couple of things, because this is why I believe there is a crisis or a crossroads in the conservative movement today. And nothing new here, as you mentioned in your very first response, Dan McLaughlin. I mean, this is the nature of political movements. We have to also keep in mind we can't talk about these things in the abstract or in a vacuum. The world changes. There was a New Deal. I say that the modern conservative movement is dated to the reaction to the New Deal. What I'm getting at here, in my very long setup to a question, we hope, is that the continuities matter more than our perceived departures when it comes to conservatism. These ideas have always been there. What ideas am I talking about? Darker, uglier, say more nativist or racist or anti-Semitic ideas, anti-government ideas that go far beyond anything Reagan imagined. And Reagan was somebody who, in the words of Max Boot in his excellent biography that came out last year, Reagan was somebody who reviled the federal government. He was a terrible manager of the federal administration, right? We're seeing something that's more to the right than that today. That's why I think it matters. It is kind of strange, though, that all this kind of blew up because of an interview Tucker Carlson gave to this Nick Fuentes character, who's a complete nullity as far as I'm concerned. Well, anyway, Nicole Hemmer, writing a review of Tannenhaus's 1,000-page biography of William F. Buckley. Nicole Hemmer, who's a liberal historian, wrote, "Over the last decade or so, historians have spent more time exploring the connections between the far right and the more mainstream right, questioning whether the difference between them is one of kind or degree, or to put another way, one of genuine ideological difference or of rhetorical performance and political posturing." In other words, the so-called Buckley firewall wasn't really the firewall we imagine it to be. And the Reagan presidency was not the way we often mythologize it today. Damon, pick it up from there.
I think there are always continuities and discontinuities. I think it is a valuable exercise to reevaluate in light of subsequent events. That's what historiography is. There's no end to it.
Yeah. And today,
in 50 years, people will be doing the same thing about our own reevaluations today.
Yeah, and let me just insert today, the reason why we're reevaluating it is because we're looking at an administration that's dismantling the federal government. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's dismantling parts of the administrative state. I don't know that it's dismantling all of the federal government. I mean, they're not rolling back Social Security. So it is an attack on the administrative state. It is, in that sense, very much a kind of a negation. I don't support that as a centrist liberal myself. We do risk, as historians and critics and pundits, in responding to the emphasis that prevailed for much of the last few decades about the right and going too far in the other direction. I'm a fan of Nikki Hemmer's work, but I did not love that review of the Buckley book. I thought it was tendentious and seemed set up to kind of highlight every terrible thing she could find in the book about Buckley, so much so that in her conclusion, her only critical comment about the book is that Tannenhaus ends by saying a nice thing about him for a sentence. Come on, that's a little much. I mean, he's a mixed character. He had flaws, he had defects. I do think that there's a way in which the story that movement conservatives have often told about him and National Review is a little self-congratulatory about how, he cleaned up the right and he kicked out the crazies. Yeah, sort of. I mean, he did at a few key moments try to do that important work. But he was also an operator on the right, and he wanted power and wanted to accomplish certain policy goals as much as he could. He wanted influence, and he understood, I think, better probably than anyone in this conversation because of his generation and the people he knew and the way the right was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that we'll call the Buchananite faction, the paleoconservative faction, the people who a generation after Buchanan's run in 92 would become Trump voters. Those people were part of the right. Yes. They were part of the coalition. And the way I prefer to talk about this in my own writing, including in my Times op-ed, is to talk in terms of junior partners in the coalition. The deal, beginning with Reagan's victory in 1980, was if you support those kind of harder, old right positions, a more aggressive attack on the federal government, hostility to immigration, very strong social conservative commitments,
Hostility to civil
skeptical of
rights.
free trade and so forth. If that's what you believe, Reagan and then the first Bush and then the second Bush, that this iteration will be very good at getting power, better than you ever have been, you restive farther right faction. And so support the Republican Party in this dispensation because it's far better than the Democrats. It's also far better than Eisenhower and Nixon, who creates the EPA and does détente with the Soviet Union, things that you voters did not like. And so you just have to accept that this is as good as it's going to get, and you'll be happy with some things and not so happy with others. And that deal held for a long time. 36 years is a long time, as Dan noted. Like, in the scheme of the back and forth of a political party, that's pretty successful for a kind of stable coalition. The problem is those harder edge voters who were always there and always part of the movement eventually said, we're tired of it.
Well, the Cold War is over.
Total failure, all of the stuff with the financial crisis, the pro-immigration stance. We've had enough. We're looking for someone else. And Trump finally became that something else.
Yeah, you jumped ahead even further than I did. I was saying the Cold War is over. I mean, that's when Buchananism starts to emerge. Buchanan was a Reagan Republican, but when the Cold War is over and Reagan is out of power, I mean, the raison d'etre, one, of Reaganism was confronting the Soviet Union.
And so, as we Americans congratulate ourselves on the victory for freedom that we first and foremost won, and won together for all mankind, we must begin to prepare for the new struggles that are already underway. All the institutions of the Cold War, from vast permanent U.S. armies on foreign soil to old alliances against communist enemies that no longer exist, to billions in foreign aid, must be re-examined. With a $4 trillion debt, with a U.S. budget chronically out of balance, should the United States be required to carry indefinitely the full burden of defending rich and prosperous allies who take America's generosity for granted as they invade our markets?
In my telling of it, it was the Cold War that sort of made that deal for the junior partnership like very, very compelling, because clearly on the Cold War, by basically picking up the liberal hawkish stance about communism from the early part of the Cold War and rebranding it as the conservative movement position, was incredibly effective for general election politics and in keeping that coalition together.
To make Damon's point, I mean, Buchanan was a Nixon Republican who went into the Reagan White House. So he sort of brought that Nixon sensibility into Reagan, into the Reagan team. I mean, I think I've long argued that there's an enormous amount of continuity in the Republican Party, that almost all the elements of the current party can be found in its first 2 decades. Lincoln represents the classical liberal side. I think actually to an extent that we tend to forget, Grant represents the more traditionally conservative side, Midwestern nationalist, evangelical moralist side. But
Grant was also a champion of civil rights. He's been getting his due from historians more recently, but I don't know. William F. Buckley was not a big fan of the civil rights movement or the civil rights legislation of the 60s, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, Buckley, we could do a whole detour on that and how Buckley's thinking evolved over time. But I do think that there's an important distinction between saying, you're going to drive people out of your movement and you're just going to continually clean house as to who gets to be in leadership. I mean, let's face it, we live in a social media age. If social media had been around earlier, you probably didn't want to know what George Washington's voters thought or Abe Lincoln's voters thought. So, we hear more from the grassroots today, and sometimes we see things bubbling up that we wouldn't necessarily want in our movement. And I think that's true on both sides of the partisan aisle. But, Buckley's fight against the Birchers, I always remind people, Buckley didn't go to war against the Birchers because they were weirdos with eccentric ideas. because a lot of people thought that Buckley and Goldwater were weirdos with eccentric ideas. He went after them because they were liars, because they were spreading things that just had a complete disregard for the truth. And he felt that the movement, its leadership and its chief organs needed to stick up for what was true over what was false.
Yeah. You mean Eisenhower wasn't a communist, I guess?
As, one of the early NR guys said, Ike's not a communist, he's a golfer. Yeah. Sort of this gatekeeping function, to the extent that there is any ability of people in a movement to do it, is not about kicking people out of the movement. It's about controlling who's in leadership. I mean, Buckley wanted no part of George Wallace. He still wanted Wallace's voters in the Republican Party, and he said so.
I just watched the YouTube debate. It's not a YouTube debate. The debate is on YouTube. The Hoover Institution controls the firing line episodes. It's the debate in 1968 between Buckley and George Wallace. And Buckley takes Wallace to task in their first real exchange. It takes like 20 minutes for Wallace to stop dissembling and interrupting. But in their first real exchange, Buckley's number one problem with Wallace was that he was a big spending Democrat, too much spending on social programs, Southern Democrat, was Buckley's first line of attack.
Name one thing in Alabama that I have supported on the governmental level that you are against.
Well, it seems to me that your if I may say so, fanatical concern for using public money for certain functions
what
that
name
might
that
otherwise. Well, for instance, you want to take care of the hospitalization. You want to take care of old people. You want to take care of the poor.
Are you against caring for the poor?
I had a feeling that you would answer that way.
Are you against
I hate the poor. I'm for shooting them. That's what I thought. No, my point is that this is a free enterprise country, and that we have a tradition here of private philanthropy, of philanthropy conducted by private people, and under programs that haven't required the mobilization of the machinery of the state.
And there's a reason why Wallace was a member of the Democratic Party in good standing into the 1980s as a statewide office holder.
But let me just stay with you, Dan McLaughlin, about the Buckley firewall and also Reaganism itself. I mean, what's your view on this? Reagan subscribed, as Max Boot makes clear in his excellent book, and I think the strength of Boot's book is that he shows how Reagan could subscribe to really crazy and just false ideas. But when he was in power, he governed pragmatically and was an effective national leader despite some of his earlier positions. But do you agree that Reagan subscribed to some, what I would consider, fringe ideas on the right?
I mean, first of all, you have to remember, one of the things about conservatism, and you noted the reaction to the New Deal, the whole history of conservatism is that things that are just accepted become more ideologized in their defense, right? Conservatism gets a name and a definition from Burke in 1790 in response to the French Revolution. And Burke wasn't saying things that were new. He was saying things that nobody thought needed to be said before, right? So Harding and Coolidge didn't consider themselves conservatives. Matt Continenti, in his great book, talks about this. They talked about just Americanism, right? They thought their ideas were just simple common sense Americanism, but they were much more vigorous about those ideas because they were reacting to Wilsonian progressivism, right? And so, by the 50s, you have really a conservative movement that doesn't exist before, but it's standing for trying to get the federal government back to where it had been for a century, right? I mean, things that we consider to be fringe ideas, like Abe Lincoln would have considered to be, this is just how the federal government's supposed to operate. The 19th century federal government, would be considered radical today.
Well, let me give you an example then from Boot's book, page 252. And this is the speech that Damon mentioned before. A Time for Choosing, October 12th, 1964, when Reagan gave a speech on behalf of Goldwater prior to Goldwater's trouncing in the 64 election. Reagan complained not only about Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but also about New Deal programs like farm subsidies and Social Security that he had avidly supported as a young man. Said Reagan, a government can't control the economy without controlling people, and they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose.
This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people.
Reagan did not explicitly mention civil rights legislation, an issue where he was at odds with most of the country. But he alluded to civil rights obliquely in this speech by arguing, it's time we realize that socialism can come without overt seizure of property or nationalization of business.
Now, it doesn't require expropriation or confiscation of private property or business to impose socialism on a people. What does it mean whether you hold the deed to or the title to your business or property if the government holds the power of life and death over that business or property, and such machinery already exists?
And I don't mean to be cherry picking here. I can't read the entire speech. And lastly, he made a joke about people who needed food stamps under JFK's food stamps pilot program.
We were told 4 years ago that 17 million people went to bed hungry each night. Well, that was probably true. They were all on a diet.
I mean, he thought that Medicaid and Medicare were kind of like socialist plots, did he not?
I mean, I think, first of all, if you listen to conservatives from the 50s and 60s and their parade of horribles of what's the worst that can happen, and you look at the federal government today, you think, my gosh, they were understating the case. I mean, Damon is right that Trump is going to war with a small tip of the iceberg of the administrative state, but he's going to leave the budget much bigger than he found it, right? And in part, that's because so much of our budget, we don't elect a government that decides on it. It just was decided in the past and it grows on its own. To that extent, Reagan was absolutely right to be alarmed at the expansions of the government. I mean, farm policy, good heavens, if you looked at our farm policy at any time in the last 90 years, it's just one form of crony socialism on top of another. And it is absolutely maintained, as all government is, ultimately by coercion. So I don't think Reagan was crazy at all to be raising the concerns that he did. And even, I mean, frankly, even if you look at the critics of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 or 65, the principled critics, not the George Wallaces of the world, in retrospect, they were wrong about the urgency of the moment requiring emergency legislation. But they were right to be worried that if you make emergency legislation a habit, and if you institutionalize it as a permanent emergency and you stretch the federal power into areas it never has before, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences, and you're going to have a lot of problems when people look at something that was responding to a century-long national emergency, really, right? The century-long disregard of Black civil rights. And you say, now let's just make this the ordinary template for how the federal government operates in every area.
I don't know. I think Reagan's record on civil rights is arguably the worst part of his legacy. Damon, am I wrong to be stressing these things when we look at some of these darker, uglier ideas on the right today, to say that this is a manifestation of some of the stuff that was there under Reagan?
I don't know. I don't typically do that. The reality, as I see it, is that we have a country with a lot of differences of opinion. Yeah. There are people who want a lot of change, who want to use government power to bring that change about in a moral direction, and I usually support those instincts. But you also have people who don't want that to happen, and we only have two parties, and the people who in general don't want to change stuff, whether you think it's good or bad change, end up in the Republican Party because it's the party that is oriented toward a more conservative dispensation, depending on, again, what the content of that changes over time. But it doesn't surprise me or really, frankly, appall me that there are people in one of the two parties who, in general, resist change because human beings are sort of, some people just don't want a lot of change, who are more nostalgic, think things were better in the past, rather than thinking they're always going to get better in the future. This is a kind of existential orientation for different kinds of people toward a kind of golden future versus a lost golden past. And it is interesting and important, for instance, that Tannenhaus's book did some really serious historical investigation. He unearthed some stuff that definitely shows that Buckley had a much more conflicted past when it came to race, that his family had deep ties to the South, and he kind of personally intervened in certain issues on the side of segregation. But it's also true that Tannenhaus shows that to the black servants that his family employed for decades, that he could be personally very generous and warm. They would go to church together, which shows that at least at an interpersonal level, it wasn't like he was appalled by black people and wanted to be separated from them. Does that mean he's a saint? No, it certainly does not, but it does show that he's a complicated person. Most people are sort of complicated in these ways. So this is the kind of thing that I say that makes the left hate me. But, I do what I can.
I admire William F. Buckley, and he did, as Dan mentioned, he did evolve. His thinking evolved on these issues over time. Ronald Reagan signed an extension of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, I believe. He signed an extension of the Voting Rights Act. So
by the time you get to Reagan, the civil rights revolution is a fait accompli. Buckley ended up saying he had been wrong in holding his older positions and writing the 1957 notorious editorial saying the South had to prevail. The fact is that, like, in the 1980s, and I can say that as someone who's old enough to remember living through this as a kid, that wasn't surprising. It's not like people were like, whoa, Reagan's really liberal on civil rights. It was just sort of like the consensus bipartisan position by that point. There was no point arguing about whether, like, we shouldn't have had the Civil Rights Act. It's only later that we get, Christopher Caldwell's book where he says, this stuff leads to huge problems. And, like, Trump is the natural outgrowth of the fact that the Civil Rights Act goes after discrimination and into anti-discrimination law. In the 80s, that was not really a position that you heard argued.
Our conversation continues next.
Breaking news for your home. Wayday. Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Wayday long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Wayday. Shop Wayfair's Wayday from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
We'll wrap up with one final question. I'll start with you, Dan. And this one is an impossible one to answer. And it's one that Damon and I have...
My favorite kind of question.
Damon and I have tangled with this in past episodes. He tangles with it all the time in his writing, including in his New York Times op-ed. That is Trumpism after Trump. So we've been talking here for an hour about the antecedents of this movement, historical, political, and whether this kind of politics, which, as I've posited, is more radical and more, I don't want to say conservative, it's just more radical, more anti-government, more conspiratorial and populist than the Reagan conservatism. Whether this kind of politics is going to stick around. I say yes. I think there has been a sea change on the right and in the Republican Party on trade, immigration, and that's in the country as well. I think the most recent election shows how Americans have changed their views on, say, the border and the disorder at the border under the Biden years, right? Just as an example. However, the politics may stick around, but whether it can win elections without Trump, that's hard to say. I would say probably not, but who knows? What's your view?
I mean, I wrote a column without rehashing it all here a couple of years ago about breaking Trumpism, if you will, into like 12 different flavors or aspects. And I think you do have to think about the fact that Trump is kind of this bundle of personal characteristics, styles, approaches, ideologies. And so, the whole thing as a coherent whole, if it were coherent, is not going to stick around after Trump is gone. But that doesn't mean that we won't be left with a number of enduring legacies from Trump in the party. We are definitely in a moment of populism. It's not just Trump. Right. It's a moment of populism on the left and the right, a moment of populism in America and around the world.
Yeah. Anti-establishmentism.
The fact that parties of the right are leaning in this direction all across the globe should tell us that there's more to this than just Trump. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to last forever. Again, I go back to my original thesis that, these things come and go. But I think that the era we are in, era of technological changes of the last 20 years.
Globalization.
Social media, smartphones, now AI, there's a lot of disruption to how people consume information, how they spread information, how they socialize, how they mate or don't, how they work. And there's also, at the same time, this great collapse in trust in all of our institutions, all of the gatekeepers, all of the experts across so many different walks of life.
And that's a bipartisan disaster, but go ahead, yeah.
There's so much of that. So I think there are good reasons why we are now in this era that transcends one man, one party, or one country. And so to that large extent, we're going to be living with that. Not forever, but for quite a while.
You know, Damon, one reason why it's hard to forecast this is because the traditional right versus left, Republican versus Democrat paradigm doesn't apply. It's establishment versus opposed to the establishment. It's city versus rural. It's the institutionalists against those who oppose the institutions.
Right. And I think that Dan is quite right, as I talk about on my Substack all the time, that this is a global phenomenon. I think it's driven by lots of things. That's a huge, long conversation. But I do think that the kind of the social media, digital networking aspect of it is very significant, that it's just easier now to politically organize far-flung, more rural voters than it used to be because, you know, they're far-flung. It's hard to organize them politically if people are living in low-density areas across the vast expanse of rural America or rural France or rural Germany. But now, because of social media, like, people find each other and they can form a social movement, a political movement, and use it to gain power in a way that used to be the left was more advantaged by being more urban. It's easier to just set up a milk crate and, you know, give a speech and kind of get workers and people in a city to kind of rally around you and you have a movement going. In the rural areas, it's harder, but now it isn't harder. It's actually just as easy. I do think that is a big contributing factor to the kind of political mobilization of more populist right voters. And again, it's happening all over the world in democracies. And there's nothing we can do to stop that now unless, you know, all the cell phones disappear, which I don't think is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so that's even leaving aside all of kind of the questions about neoliberal policy and immigration and refugees and national coherence, that the actual substance of the grievances of these voters and how, you know, some of those are legitimate and others maybe not as much, but they're here to stay, I think, for the time being, regardless.
Yeah. So I will just end with 2 book recommendations, and I'll give mine now. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you to do this because I did say we'd wrap up, but this will give you a moment to think of one book you think people should read. Damon, actually, I think I know which book you're going to recommend because you mentioned it in your Substack.
Oh, all right. Well, sure. I mean, it's easy because I didn't have anything else prepped, but Laura K. Field has a new book called Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. So if listeners are interested in almost having just like a taxonomy, who these people are, the intellectuals of the Trumpist right, and she sort of breaks them into different styles or flavors of groups. It's a lively read and interesting and a nice snapshot of kind of where the more Trumpy side of the right is in 2025.
Well, here are my 2. Dan, you get another moment to think of yours. They're history books. As people know, I'm a fan of Sean Wilentz. He wrote a book called The Age of Reagan about 15 years ago. The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 to 2008. So that's number 1, The Age of Reagan by Sean Wilentz, and published last year, Max Boot's Reagan, His Life and Legend. The book is not about Trump, although Trump appears in the conclusion. Dan, book recommendation.
I mean, I could recommend any number of Reagan books that I think one would prefer to some of those. But I think the overarching narrative book that is very useful to read is Matt Continetti's book, The Right, The 100-Year War for the conservative movement. And I think he gives, you know, he starts his story in the 1920s and goes up through Trump and prior to the current Trump term. But it's a great sort of 1-volume reader on where, for good and for ill, where the right has been over the past century.
All right. All these books will go in the show notes. Dan, I'm surprised you didn't like Wilentz's book.
I preferred No Property in Man.
On the founding. Well, most people would probably say Wilentz is better on that period of history than more recent history, especially the editors at NR.
What about Dylan?
He's Sean's Unstoppable. Just wrote like a 100-page essay about Bob Dylan. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Martin.
The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades. They will not go away in days, weeks, or months, but they will go away. They will go away because we, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, 30 years on. When the Jewish religious fanatic Yigal Amir assassinated Rabin, did he also murder the peace process? That's next as we report History as It Happens. And make sure to sign up for my newsletter. Go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.